Aloha everyone, it's Ajanette and I am here with your Chapter 2, Part 3 lecture, and this should be the last of it. So we're diving into theories now that are used in the field of human sexuality to help us kind of understand different perspectives and interpretations of how our human sexuality plays into our overall functioning and development. The first theory is the psychoanalytic perspective, which is Freud. And by all accounts, Freud's probably the most popular and influential psychologist and theory. Unfortunately, though, his theory is not well supported by the research. In fact, a lot of insurance companies do not pay for therapists that subscribe to his theory because there isn't any real empirical basis or evidence for his theory. And I would argue that his theory does have some sexual tones that are a bit odd and a little unsettling for many. And so we're going to talk about that. Although I by and large do not agree with Freud's perspective and I don't subscribe to a psychoanalytic perspective, I'm thankful for the work that he did. I'm thankful for the attention that he drew to mental health. I'm thankful for his contribution by effectively creating the field of therapy. I am thankful for the conversation and dialogue that emerges from his theory, but the theory itself has lots to be desired. So, first of all, let's talk a little bit about Freud. Freud grew up in the Victorian era. And if you study history, you know that's a very sexually repressed era. Remember, that was a time when women wore collars up to their chins. Their ankles didn't show. If their ankles showed, they were viewed as absolute sluts, right? And so it's a very different type of era. He himself had a very sexually attractive and desirable stepmother and had some attraction to her, and so that may have been an influence in his theory. He also grew up in a time when there were very patriarchal, sexist structures really throughout the world, even from the area of the world where he came from. And so it was very much a time when women were not valued, and his theory by and large is very much has some sexist undertones to it. He basically came up with a number of different theories. He came up with a personality theory, he came up with a development theory, and he came up with a therapeutic perspective and what he feels drives psychological challenges and disorders, and then how it should be addressed. And so that's in his therapy perspective. His personality theory suggests that there's really three main components: the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, underlying those components is our libido. So he suggested that at every stage of life, we are driven by the sexual energy that we have. And that sexual energy really is what kind of guides our behavior. It guides our development. It shapes us in very fundamental ways. And so that is reflected in really every theory that he developed: personality development and therapeutic approach. You see the sexual undertones, you see the sexual emphasis. Now, in terms of the personality theory, your sexual libido would largely be reflected in the id. Now, the id is driven by that pleasure principle, so it suggests that we operate on these primal urges, right? I want it now. And so we don't really have a great ability to kind of counter those urges or resist that temptation. And that id, if left to its own devices, will just drive us to a very pleasure-seeking life. Now, I'm going to jump to the superego. So I look at the id as the little devil, that wants what it wants and it wants it now. Okay? And then the superego is that little angel that kind of counters the id. It is the morality principle. It is the Victorian era norms and rules and stigmas, right? That's not proper. That's not appropriate. That wouldn't be pure and wholesome and pious. That's not how ladies behave, Jeanette. That type of thing. So that superego is driven by the morality principle. It's the one that gets us to toe the line. It's that little, Jiminy Cricket in our head telling us that's wrong and we should be doing what's right. And it kind of expects us to be pure and perfect. So the id is driving you toward these primal urges. Just do it, take it. And then the superego is, no, Jeanette, that's wrong. That's inappropriate. And both of those are kind of extremes, right? Like, I see a delicious cake. I'm not going to bury my face in it and stuff it all down. But I'm also not going to be like, oh, chocolate's not good for me, right? I'm going to go somewhere in the middle. And that's where your ego steps in. Your ego is the reality principle. It's the balancing force. It's the negotiator, the mediator between this pleasure and morality principle. And so it teaches you, maybe I can have a piece of the cake. I can't eat the whole damn thing, but I can have a piece of it, right? So that's the moderation voice. Either way, this undertone driving force is this sexual energy that's pent up inside of us. Now, psychosexual development, again, this is the driving force, is that libido. So you have these sexual urges in different places throughout your life, and Freud suggested that is the center focal point of development, and talked about kind of what are the appropriate responses. And it's about balance again. If our needs go unmet in those areas, then we can become fixated and develop challenges. If they become overindulged, then we can become fixated and we incur challenges. And so we'll go through these different stages. The stages are reflected here in this picture: oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital. Oral is for that first year, that infancy. If you think about it, infants put everything in their mouth, right? Their thumbs, pacifiers, toys, nipples. If they get your hand, they just start to suck. And it's a reflex, right? It's a survival reflex. It's meant to, you don't have to teach them how to eat. They can automatically eat. And so, yes, most of their activity is oral. Is that a sexual drive? No, it's just a survival drive, right? Do they have desires, sucking, eating, biting? Of course they do. But, does it have to have the sexual undertone? No. Freud suggested that if you feed them too much, they might become orally fixated. If you don't feed them enough, they might become orally fixated. So they might be thumb suckers for the rest of their lives, or they might pick up bad smoking habits, something to that effect. Moving on into toddlerhood, children experience what's called the anal phase. And in this case, he suggested that the sexual driving force centers around the anus, or potty training, right? This is when a child starts to become aware of their bodies and have some degree of control over their bodies, particularly in the area of potty training. Again, you can overindulge or underindulge, so you can have a parent that doesn't engage in active potty training and the child's still wearing diapers at 6 years old. You can have a very demanding, rigid, harsh, and critical parent that that is very insensitive and cold when they have mistakes. And so they can become anally fixated or anally expulsive. So if you've heard, someone described as anal in terms of a fixation, they are usually very orderly, controlled, rigid. They like to do things a certain way, and that may come from an overbearing parent that was demanding in that way. Somebody that's expulsive might come from a parent that really didn't enforce healthy potty training techniques or support tools, or even a supportive, warm, nurturing environment. And so, in that regard, their needs weren't met. They weren't fully gratified in those areas, and so consequently, they became fixated. Now, let me just note that if you become fixated at one stage, it negatively impacts every subsequent stage. And so it kind of, screws you for the rest of your life. That's how Freud looked at things. It was very pathological, like you were damaged goods for the rest of your life. And, and that determined your fate and your future. So it wasn't anything that you had true conscious control over. And, that's definitely an area of his theory that I fundamentally disagree with. In the phallic stage, you're moving into that early childhood stage, 3 to 5. And the children then, now, when you think of something that's phallic, it looks like genitals. So this is where, the focus on the genitals come in. It's not uncommon to find a 3-year-old with their hands in their pants, or 4 or 5, maybe even in each other's pants, right? This is actually also when physical sensations really come online, right? And they're not in their diapers anymore, and so they're exposed to the sensations, and it's pleasurable. I'll never forget my little boy in the shower, and he's like, "Oh, mommy, it grows," and he talked about how it tickles when he touches it. That's great, babe, but we got to get ready for school, so I can't afford for you to have a half an hour shower while you watch it grow, right? Or, babe, I love that it feels good for you, but Target's probably not the best place to be touching it, right? And so it's about setting healthy boundaries for them. If you, again, you put too much pressure and focus on it, and you criticize them, and you're harsh with them, and then they can become fixated, and they can become promiscuous, or they can become sexually repressed, and it's just a very unhealthy approach. Freud also suggests that this is when the Oedipus complex comes in, and the Oedipus and the Electra complex are outlined down here. So the Oedipus applies to little boys, where they basically fall in love with their moms. They want to have sex with their moms. They want to be, they want to grow up and marry their moms. They're afraid of getting their penis cut off, and they're afraid of their father, because their father has a penis and it's bigger than their penis. And so, fathers dominate. And so they might be a little bit, they want to be mama's boys. Or maybe they even, develop bitterness and anxiety toward their fathers, because their father's competition for their mom's love and affection and attention. And then, this all centers around the story of Oedipus, the Greek tragedy. And so that's where it kind of gets its influence, its inspiration, and its name. The Electra complex is the opposite for females, where they actually want a penis. They're envious that they don't have a penis, so they're drawn to their dad, and they want their dad to impregnate them as a way to substitute for that penis. And so they develop animosity toward their mom, and they have conflict with their mom. And this is kind of the basis for that mother-daughter conflict growing up, and that father-son conflict growing up that often emerges in families. But, I don't in any way think it's linked to this. I don't. Yeah, you do hear little preschoolers saying, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to marry you," or that's just kind of them trying to understand roles. It doesn't mean they have any sexual desires or intentions toward their parent. And certainly, there's not an animosity where they want to kill their parent, their opposite sex parent, or excuse me, their same sex parent. So, it's to me, again, an area where I fundamentally differ from Freud. And this has largely been rejected. So I really wish this weren't a focal theory, but, it is what it is. We still have much progress to be made. The latent stage, Freud also got this stage wrong. He suggested that this was kind of a dormancy stage during middle childhood when they don't really have any kind of sexual urges or driving force. Absolutely wrong. This is actually when you often have your first crush. This is actually when you start to discover your own sexual orientation and what you're attracted to and who you're attracted to. So completely wrong. And then finally, in the teen years, once puberty emerges, the genital stage starts. Again, your genitals are growing, your body's changing, you're experiencing puberty. And so this is when sexual interests truly emerge. Freud suggested this is actually when we develop our sexual interest. Again, he's wrong, develops earlier. And his theory focused on heterosexual interest and the importance of, kind of learning those heterosexual relationship skills. But he did not account for the sexual diversity that we know exists and has existed since the beginning of humankind. So, a limited, narrow view of our development and our sexuality, indeed. Another perspective, excuse me, so sorry. Another perspective that comes from psychology is learning theory, or the behaviorist perspective. And the behaviorist perspective, I don't know if you've ever heard of the nature-nurture debate, where nature looks at our biological and genetical driving forces. Like, we're born with a distinct personality, we're born with our sexual orientation and our preferences, and that's just who we are. And then the nurture perspective is all about the environment. We were made how we are based on our environment. I had a friend who told me she's a very devout Christian, love her to death, but she has a very ill-informed and uneducated perspective on sexuality. And she has a niece that is gay. And from her perspective, she's a lesbian because, she suffered abuse and trauma, and that made her hate men. I know lots of lesbians that don't hate men, right? But they really love women, and that's okay, right? It doesn't always have to be something traumatic that happened in your experience or your environment that quote unquote made you gay. Actually, research shows there's probably a larger genetic component than what we realize. In fact, we know that from behavioral genetics and twin studies, where we look at the rate of homosexuality among just regular siblings and compare that to the rate of common or shared homosexuality between fraternal twins, and compare that to identical twins. And so identical twins have 100% same DNA, and then they're monozygotic, so they came from the same egg. Dizygotic twins came from two separate eggs, so they don't share DNA. They share just as much DNA as a regular sibling. However, they also share DNA and an environment from utero on. And then, of course, siblings don't share. Of course, when we're biological siblings, we get the same genetic contribution, but we have a unique DNA, right? That's all our own. And so, research shows that the closer the genetic similarity, the greater the likelihood is. So there's like an 85% chance that if one monozygotic twin or identical twin is gay, the other one is too. But it's only like a 30% chance for a dizygotic twin. So it's really interesting. There's also research to suggest that sexuality and orientation is probably transferred on the maternal DNA rather than the paternal DNA. So it comes on the X chromosome, mom's X chromosome. And although genetics is complicated, right? It's not just one particular gene that contributes to any particular feature. It's often a combination of genes. And I don't honestly know, given the level of homophobia and bias in our society, I don't know that it's really safe to identify a specific gene, because I could actually see efforts made to try to eradicate that gene, and that's wholly problematic too, because that gene likely plays a role in other elements of functioning and life. And so in any event, the behaviorist perspective, again, while it's important and it likely contributes to many other things related to sexuality, which we'll talk about, it likely does not relate to sexual orientation. However, it's very, very, very much connected to fetishes, to sexual disorders, interestingly enough. We'll talk more about that when we get to that chapter, but this perspective, a cognitive behavioral approach in treating sexual disorders, is the most effective and successful approach. In fact, cognitive behavioral therapy in general tends to do really well for a lot of conditions, anxiety being one of them as well. That being said, there's kind of three main types of conditioning, and by conditioning we mean learning or training. And there's three main types of learning that fall under learning theories, all of which are based on something in the environment. In classical conditioning, it's all about a stimulus and response. And so a stimulus elicits a particular response, like food elicits salivation from Pavlov's study, right? We learned that. But when you pair two stimuli, the neutral stimuli that's unconditioned it's not associated with that particular response, can be paired with the conditioned stimuli and eventually substitute for it. So you pair the food with a bell often enough, then just hearing the bell, a dog will salivate, or a person will salivate. And we'll see this, like we're conditioned to eat at noon for lunch, and that lunch bell rings at school and we're hungry, or as it's approaching we're hungry, or you use a can opener to open your cat's food and they start running because they've been conditioned to recognize that sound is associated with their food. Same thing when a dog hears like a treat bag or any kind of bag crinkling, they come running for a snack, right? That's classical conditioning. From a sexual standpoint, think about fetishes, right? Like I may have been sexually pleasured, and I might develop an association to women's underwear or to high heels or something like that. And so those underwear now sexually arouse me and gratify me, just as if I were engaged in that sexual act. So classical conditioning is stimulus and response. Operant conditioning is about reinforcement. It's about consequences. Were you reinforced or punished? So if in fact you were found masturbating and you were punished, then punishment extinguishes or reduces a behavior. reinforcement increases a behavior. So if you engaged in a particular type of sex or had some sort of item or toy and or porn, let's say, and that helped you orgasm, well, you're more likely to watch porn again, right? And so it reinforces your use or use of porn, or you engaging in a particular behavior, because it ended with something favorable for you. So stimulus response, classical conditioning, consequences, operant conditioning, either reinforcement, which increases the behavior, interest, or arousal, or consequences that decrease the behavior, like punishment. And then social learning theory is about observation. It requires a social connection or interaction. You are observing someone else, and through that observation, you're watching them. They're modeling a particular behavior for you, and you're imitating it, right? You identify with it and you imitate it. And so gender roles are very common, or maybe you saw that your mom was more prudish sexually, so you became more prudish sexually. Maybe you learned how you were expected to behave or dress. Sometimes that's a combination thereof of all these different types of conditioning, right? And research has actually shown that operant conditioning has some element of classical conditioning in it as well, because we associate that reinforcement with the behavior. We associate that punishment with the behavior, so that it can still be a stimulus response situation. So all of these theories kind of they work together, and they all fall under the umbrella of learning theory or behaviorism, which all means that we learned our sexual preferences, we learned our sexual behavior and attitudes and values from the environment through one of these processes. Again, doesn't account for the biological and genetic evidence that exists. So one piece of the puzzle that helps to explain sexuality, but certainly not all of it. The final thing that really is important in this theory, particularly Bandura's social learning theory, Bandura presented this notion of self-efficacy, and that's different than self-esteem. Self-esteem is how we value ourselves, right? Efficacy is related to our self-competence. It's how do I believe in my capacity or capability to do something. And when we talk about our sexual efficacy, interestingly enough, that confidence, that belief in our ability to be sexually attractive or to arouse someone, it very much impacts our sense of confidence and our self-esteem and the health of our relationship quite often. In fact, men report that confidence and a sense of sexual efficacy or self-efficacy in women is highly attractive and desirable. It turns men on. So it doesn't matter how big you are. It doesn't matter if your boobs are lopsided. It doesn't matter man or woman, or a transgender individual. It doesn't matter if you have a mole or if you're flawed or you have cellulite. It doesn't matter. Typically, that confidence can be very alluring and arousing and attractive to a partner. And so building healthy sexual image and self-image and sexual confidence and sexual efficacy is really, really an important thing and goal for the class. So I hope as we learn together, you're willing to explore more about you, learn more about you, and step into your sexuality with confidence. Okay, so let's move on to a couple of different theories. Social exchange theory, there's actually been a book about relationships called The Love Bank, and it absolutely conveys social exchange theory, where, people are hedonistic or pleasure seeking, so this definitely kind of has a little bit of Freud undertone to it. But we do things for rewards. There's a whole notion and debate about altruism and can we really be selfless? Can we really just do things just for the sake of doing good? And a social exchange theorist would say, no, we do it for some sort of reward. Even the idea of feeling good is a reward, right? And so we bring that social exchange mentality into our relationships, sexually or romantic, where we look at the pros and cons and, am I getting enough pleasure? And I will say, like, I've left a relationship because it wasn't sexually gratifying for me. And, I think that it's important to have communication and conversation and be willing to prioritize each other's sexual pleasure. And if for whatever reason you cannot have those open dialogues and you can't have those discussions and compromises, then it undermines the health of the relationship and the quality of the relationship. And for many relationships that are romantic in nature, assuming you're not asexual, right? Then that the quality of that sexual encounter and relationship can be a huge part of the relationship and whether it's perceived as valuable. Cognitive theory, cognitions is focused on our thoughts, our minds, our perceptions, our interpretations. And from a cognitive theorist perspective, your perception is reality. So how you see things is how the world is, right? If you conceive of something as being negative, then it's going to be perceived and received as negative, right? If I think something's ick, my daughter always says, "Don't yuck my yum," and so if I perceive something as yuck, then I lose the opportunity to experience it in an open way, in a way that actually might open doors and lead to tremendous pleasure for me because I'm so fixed in my own perception. And so it can be a hindrance to your sexual, receptiveness. Being willing to explore a little bit with your partner, being willing to try new things. Yeah, I've never done it. It's not on my list, but it's something my partner wants. Hey, as long as it's not violating, a fundamental aspect of me or my autonomy, then okay, we can try it. There's got to be some communication, right? But you've got to be willing to kind of examine your own perceptions and maybe reframe things. Also, think about these schemas. So when we talk about a schema, this is like a set of expectations around a particular thing. So it's a knowledge base. In terms of sexual schemas, there are blueprints. So we might expect that the man is supposed to pick us up and carry us across the altar if we're a woman, right? Because we've been raised in this Hollywood idea of heterosexual relationships that are overly romantic and kind of glorify sex. And they don't really portray the kind of fumbling and awkwardness that often occurs in the first sexual encounter. They don't really portray the smells or the odors. They don't really portray the, hey, can we talk about condoms or birth control? They don't really portray the reality parts of that sexual encounter. And so we might have a very false schemata or blueprint or script that we're trying to adhere to or that sets our expectations. And so we're left with disappointment after. Of course. Because if Hollywood or porn, my son got caught watching porn when he was in junior high. So I had to have a conversation with the vice principal, who is the disciplinarian, which, not a fun situation. However, I'm a very empowered and educated woman, right? So, I said, hey, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. I'm not sure if there's an expectation of any kind of punitive consequence, but I have no intention of disciplining my son for watching porn. I think it's a perfectly normal response for a young boy who is experiencing puberty. So, I am certainly willing to have a conversation with him and talk to him about boundaries and location and when it's appropriate and where it's appropriate to watch porn. But, the porn itself is not problematic for me. And, I'm thankful she was very supportive and receptive of that. And she wasn't in any way trying to shame him or expecting me to shame him. And I really appreciated that. But I did go back and have conversations because my concern was the porn is creating a schema for him, right? I wanted to, I said, hey, babe, I'm not in any way judging you. I think it's perfectly normal. And I'd really love to have a conversation with you about the types of porn that you're drawn to and how you decide and how you think it's influencing you, because it's not reality, right? That is not how sexual relationships or romantic relationships actually occur. So it might be creating some misperceptions and kind of unhealthy expectations. And then I also had a concern with him that they're often very objectifying and potentially abusive toward women, and so we had that conversation too. So think about your schemas. Think about what you think a sexual encounter is supposed to, quote unquote, be like. Think about what informs that schema. Think about the biases that might exist. There may be some inaccuracies. So I would love to hear about your schemas. If anyone wants to drop that into our question for the week and our sex forums, and we can have a dialogue about your schemas, I'd love to talk about that. And particularly for those of you that may not have had sex yet, then I would love for others to chime in and have a conversation about the realities of sexual encounters, because they're not always romantic, and they certainly don't, most of the time, they don't meet the Hollywood standard. And then finally, Gender Schemata by Sandra Bem. She really talks about, not just our sexual schemas, but our gender. We have these blueprints for what we're supposed to behave like and be like and dress like and talk like and sit like as a boy or as a girl, and how these very stereotypical expectations create these schemas in our minds and consequently create our perceptions and behaviors in ways that may not always be healthy. So we kind of uphold gender roles by passing on these schema to one another, generation after generation. And I say, break through that glass ceiling. I say, break through those gender restrictions and be authentically you, whatever that might be. I really value authenticity and recognizing gender diversity. And yeah, I don't try to shove people in boxes, right? So be you. Okay, so there are some what we call critical theories. And critical theories, they're not trying to get you to be critical of others, right? They critically examine. When you talk about critical thinking, right? We analyze, we think for ourselves, we question. Well, how does that work? They just don't blindly accept and adopt what has been largely and widely accepted. So feminist theory doesn't widely accept patriarchy and sexism. It critically examines the inequality and the ways in which our gender and our sex influence our experiences in the world, influence the privileges and opportunities or lack thereof that we may have access to based upon our gender and sex. So What's really interesting is a lot of people think that feminism is man-hating, right? It's not. Yes, do we subscribe to the notion of girl power and more power to you? And yes, break through that vice presidency, break through that presidency, become a senator, become a brain surgeon. Yes, we subscribe to that. But we also subscribe to this idea of equality and access for all marginalized identities, not just women, women of color, people with gender expansive identities, people with sexually expansive identities. We recognize that this patriarchal, heteronormative, cisnormative world is limiting and debilitating, particularly for those that have identities that don't align with those expectations and false expectations and rules. When we break free from those gender roles, we recognize their societal consequences. And so we, as feminists, we believe in breaking down those barriers and giving everybody an opportunity to be authentically them and yet still have access to thrive and succeed in whatever they may pursue for themselves, right? We're also mindful of how those identities intersect. So, yes, as a woman, I face barriers. As a woman of color, though, I might face different barriers. I'm a woman of color that has passing privilege. I appear as white. I'm white presenting. So I still experience white privilege as I navigate the world. As a black woman, something might be said in a meeting that's perceived as angry. It adheres to that angry black woman stereotype. And people perceive it that way, but I can say the exact same thing in the exact same volume in the exact same tone, but because I'm white, it's not perceived that way. And that's just the reality of life. And so, yes, we're both women, but a woman of color experiences the world differently than a white woman. And so, certainly, feminist theory examines those intersectionalities of identity. And this is why you doing your own social identity wheel, understanding your various identities, understanding the privilege or power that comes from those different identities, and understanding how different identities intersect to create a unique experience. I've grown up in the same household with 3 other siblings. We've had the same income level. We've had the same parents. We've had the same financial opportunities, but they are brown women and I am a white woman. So the world treats us differently. And so that intersectional identity has shaped very different, unique experiences for each of us. Queer theory also subscribes to all of those things that feminist theory subscribes to, but on top of that, queer theory very intentionally, critically examines the binary perceptions of gender and sexuality that has been, I'm going to argue, falsely perpetuated and shoved down our throats here in this country. Not all countries and not all cultures subscribe to these binaries. This is not a new concept. As I shared with you, you've had gender diverse identities in ancient cultures across the globe. And so queer theory is really challenging more contemporary, limited, narrow views of gender and sexuality, and it's challenging that heteronormative and cisnormative narrative that shapes so much of our discourse as a country, politically and otherwise. And even religion gets into this discourse, and it's, to me, tragic and problematic because, as I've shared with you, in Indian culture, in Native Hawaiian culture, there very much was a belief and viewpoint of the spiritual powers of individuals with gender and sexually diverse identities. So queer theory combats what you might know as biphobia or transphobia. I really prefer the word transmisia because phobias are a psychological disorder, right? And they're often created through some classical conditioning circumstance or environmental circumstance. And phobia talks about a fear, right? It's a fear. And unfortunately, there's actually a allowable legal argument for becoming violent or murdering someone that's transgender or homosexual, and it really kind of perpetuates a toxic masculinity perspective. And where I was making out with this person, I found out they were transgender, and that's why I attacked them and murdered them, and somehow that justifies it because my fear of learning about their identity gave me a right to be violent with them. And that's bullshit. I'm sorry. That's bullshit. So, so I want to move us away from the concept of phobia. I don't want to give any credibility to our very explicit and blatant bias against bisexual and transgendered individuals. And I want to really address it as transmesia rather than transphobia, or bimesia instead of biphobia. Okay, so moving on to some sociological theories. Now, there's three main sociological perspectives: conflict theory, functionalism, and then symbolic interaction theory. Your book really only focuses on symbolic interaction theory, which typically psychology is a micro perspective from the inside out, and sociology is a macro perspective looking at outside in, looking at the social influences on the individual instead of the individual themselves, right? But symbolic interaction theory is the most micro of the sociological perspectives, in that it looks at very small scale interactions and how those interactions and relationships and exchanges support the continuation of a particular social norm or role or order, right? So when we're talking about sexuality, we can think about role taking, right? That interaction in a relationship, what role you play, what role I play. And we're having a very real conversation now about the inequitable distribution of labor inside a home where both parents are working. You might even have a woman making more money than her husband in today's day and age, and yet the majority of the household labor and emotional labor for the family still falls on the woman quite often. Or if they're out on a restaurant and the child's misbehaving, the judgment is often passed toward the woman. And so those interactions and dynamics within that relationship and the rules and the gender stereotypes and expectations that are placed upon individuals not only impacts the quality of the relationship, but it also, from a symbolic interactionist perspective, it also fits into the larger social world and order, right? Sexual scripts, again, go back to, an alpha male. He's supposed to dominate. He's supposed to initiate. He's supposed to chase me. These are stereotypes. There are expectations and scripts that have been taught to us, and we've been socialized to believe that this is the way it's supposed to be. No, it's perfectly okay if I want to, grab my man and initiate sex, or grab my woman and initiate sex, right? I love the TikTok trend where there's the women flipping script. They're in heterosexual relationships, and they smack their husband's ass while he's in the kitchen, or they pin him up against a wall and grope him a little bit, and the men are like, "What? That's not great." So we can challenge these scripts, we can challenge these roles, and we can define the roles in a way that works best for us in our relationships. And then sexual fields, thinking about the field or the context in which that sexual encounter is happening, right? Think about the boundaries that I set. When, where, how. How do I value the word no? How do I value consent? How do I show? I was at a wedding this weekend, and this man really started to piss me off. And it was a very culturally based wedding. My friend is, has a Swana identity. She's from northern Iraq, and so it was a very Middle Eastern wedding, and so I was a little nervous about calling this dude out. So instead, I took a more subtle approach and kind of protected my friend from him. But, he was trying to pull my friend out to dance, and my friend was saying no. And he said, I don't take no for an answer. And, in a normal situation, I would have been like, look, motherfucker, you're going to take no for an answer, and you are going to respect her. But as I'm thinking about, my friend and the social and cultural expectations of that wedding, and I'm like, I don't know if this is a cousin, an uncle, or whomever, right? So I didn't want to make those waves, but I did very much intervene. I moved right in between he and my friend and kind of pushed her away, and we danced away together. There was no way I was going to let him impose himself on her. And so those boundaries, that sense of control, that sense of entitlement, really, it very much is a condition of our American mentality and what we would call rape culture. And we'll talk about that later in the semester. But in the interim, feel free to do a little research on that on your own, rape culture. And then finally, social institutions definitely have an influence. We interact not just with our partner based on the influences of these institutions, but we interact within the institutions themselves. And they influence the relationship, whether it's religion. That Catholic wedding this weekend very much was talking about you will accept children, and it was all about procreation. It was mentioned like 6 times in that wedding ceremony, and I was like, wow, I don't think I had ever observed that before in a Catholic wedding. Or the economy and the economic expectations, and even the rights when it comes to Social Security law, and who can get a financial benefit from their ex-spouse or their deceased spouse. And this is why same-sex marriage was so important, because economically, taxation, all of these laws created a very different circumstance for same-sex married couples than it did for heterosexual married couples. And so those social institutions restrict and limit and hinder the types of relationships and benefits that one can enjoy in those relationships. The notion of family, can same-sex couples have the same adoption rights as heterosexual couples? Can we even gain access to the proper medical treatment? Are we pathologizing certain conditions? Homosexuality at one point was in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which defines what's considered a psychological disorder. And so all of these things, all of these laws, all of these social systems, all of these systemic issues impact our sexual and romantic and familial relationships and our behavior. And so I find it really interesting how we talk about, well, they choose that lifestyle, right? You know what? They don't. Who would choose to live a life of abuse and stigma and judgment and restriction and all these barriers that they have to face in every single social institution? It's just who they are. It's not about choice, right? In fact, many individuals in the LGBTQ community may struggle with their own identities and their own um, their own process within themselves because they've heard all these negative messages, maybe within their own homes, from their own parents, from their own siblings, from their own aunties and uncles. And so, they may want to resist their natural inclinations because they don't want to face that kind of judgment and wrath from their families and society as a whole. Um, so I just want us to be very intentionally reflective on the barriers that individuals face with diverse identities. And wherever you're at in your circle, certainly don't perpetuate that shit, right? And I would often, and I would even go so far as to encourage you to take that upstander approach and actually work to break down those barriers and those false expectations and those roles that are no longer serving us, right? And that don't contribute to a just and fair and inclusive society. So, okay, I do want to close with this notion that we presented you with just a few of the theoretical perspectives, and this book actually presents you with far fewer than many textbooks that I've used in the past. I do add my resources as supplemental resources in the learning management system, and so you can go back into the course and have access to those. Do keep in mind that whatever the perspective, there's some nugget of value in there, right? But most of us as professionals and practitioners and academics and scholars, most of us draw on multiple perspectives to inform our views, right? We don't subscribe purely to a psychoanalytic perspective or purely to a behaviorist perspective or purely to a cognitive or social exchange or social interactionist. We draw on multiple perspectives. I am wholly a feminist, but I'm also a psychologist, right? And feminism, like human sexuality, is an interdisciplinary field, so it draws on all of those different disciplines: biology, sociology, psychology, anthropology. But know that all of these things interact. All these things. We, yes, are born with a particular propensity, but yes, we are still shaped by society and outside influences. So it's a unique interaction for each one of us that creates a very unique experience. So try to avoid generalizations, stereotypes. Very rarely does something apply to everyone, right? It might apply to a lot of people, more people. It might be common statistically, but it never applies to everybody, right? Think about your own cultural values, beliefs, biases, and assumptions. Reflect on those, and question why do I think this is quote unquote normal or natural or moral? Why does my view or belief system have any more credibility than anybody else's, right? I have to read, not have to, I have the privilege of reading student journals, and one might be a Buddhist, and one might be a Catholic, and one might be a Christian, and one might be an atheist, and I've even read, Wiccan students, who subscribe to a Wiccan faith. Okay, great. Who am I to say who's right and who's wrong? I'm not there to judge them. I'm not there to rank them. I'm there to support them, to love them, to educate them, to empower them, and to be a cheerleader. That's what I'm there for. Human sexuality, the human condition is complex. It's unique. And diversity adds a richness and a wealth of knowledge and insight. And so I think it's a way for us to truly appreciate the wonder of our sexuality, and the joy and pleasure it can bring, both physically, sexually, and emotionally. So what I'm effectively saying is embrace other perspectives. So your chapter ends with some reflection questions. I do want you to review those, consider those, ponder those, include those in your chapter 2 lecture notes. So as we wrap up chapter 2, as with all chapters, you're going to make sure you thoroughly read the chapter in the book, watch the lecture video, consider watching and reviewing the supplemental learning materials that are also available to you. As you're doing the reading and the watching, take detailed notes. Your reading lecture notes should provide an outline of the main ideas that were discussed and the concepts that were presented in those materials. You're also going to need to write definitions, maybe examples, ideally in your own words, of new terms and vocab that was introduced throughout those readings and throughout the lectures and the videos that are offered. And then I want you to answer the reflection questions at the end of each chapter. And then finally, make sure you click on the link that's embedded in your course and present 3 proposed test questions for your final. And then you're going to submit that as your lecture and reading notes assignment, and then make sure you do your learning activity as well. Thanks so much. I appreciate you listening. I hope you are all really in a position where you're open to learning and growing and challenging your own biases and adopting a more empowered and empowering self-image. Much love and aloha to all of you. Bye-bye.